Okay, finally we continue. And let me start with an apology. I've started another engineering contract 4 weeks ago, and as usual, finding that this throws a monkey wrench in my ability to do these videos. You can see my surroundings, my new mansion here in North Carolina, and I'm going to slug through though and try to produce these, but at a slower rate, undoubtedly, until I finish this contract. For most viewers, especially those that discover this years down the road, it won't matter at all because the videos are all lined up. But I do have a few people that pounce on each episode, the few, the faithful, each Friday. And to you, all I can say is I'm sorry, and maybe take this opportunity to peek at any of the series that you may have missed. On that note, I want to also encourage new people that might be dabbling or discovered this in your feed. But you don't need to go back and listen to every video starting with Unit 1. I believe this material is such that you can pretty much dive in anywhere. It does build in one sense, but in another sense, it's this holistic approach that Van Til takes to knowledge is like the whole pie, and you can kind of stick your finger in at any point and then start from there. So give it a try, I would urge you. Okay, so we've reached the point where Van Til is going to focus on Plato. Actually, I should say more accurately, where Bahnsen has collected a variety of passages from Van Til dealing with Plato. And so let me just give a quick introduction to Plato. The key, most important idea in Plato, of course, is the realm of the ideas. And what Plato was proposing here was an answer to both the skeptics and to the sophists, neither of which believed knowledge was possible because of things like change. And how can, given this world of flux, how can you say that we know anything since everything is changing, and the act of changing means that it becomes something that it is not, therefore it is and is not at the same time, and it's contradictory, and so forth. And so Plato agreed with him, essentially, and said that we don't really have knowledge of the world of flux, but behind it, there has to be this supratemporal world of forms and ideas. And the world of flux reminds us of those forms because we must have also pre-existed, our souls must have pre-existed our life on this earth. And the reason for that is because we do seem to gain knowledge of common elements between the world of flux, and those common elements, known as universals, themselves have stability. But where is that stability to be found? Well, it must be found in this world of ideas. And how is it possible for us to know them? Well, we must have known them before we were born. We must have had a pre-incarnate existence. And today, there's not really any pure Platonists. It was too difficult to maintain this view because, for one thing, if you think about it, suppose you suppose your purified soul encountered the pure form of chairness, the chair that's universal, chairness chair. Well, you can't sit in it. Your soul can't sit in that chair. So, in a sense, the chair needs material things to give sense to itself. So, in a sense, it needs its own shadows. The chairs that we see down here on Earth are shadows of the ideal form, but really the ideal form needs the shadows. And similarly, why did we fall? Why did we fall from this pre-incarnate state of bliss where we dwelt in the land of forms? What was the impetus that caused that kind of fall? And so people following in Plato's wake, some of which are known as Neoplatonists, but perhaps you could call all of the different types of attempts to be Platonic as a form of Neoplatonism, inevitably they have to find some form of intermediate, like emanations or intermediate mediating forms, halfway in between. And it kind of shows its own impossibility just by these attempts. And so you might ask, well, if there are no pure Platonists, why is it even important to study this? Well, it's important because Plato is the greatest. He's the goat of all philosophy that's not informed by the Bible. And so, in a sense, if he fails in this endeavor, you could almost say everybody fails. Of course, we're going to look at the everybody in detail. But that would be the first reason. The second reason is that I think that the Neoplatonic forms actually do live among us. And it's in the form of mystery religions, Egyptian philosophy, secret societies, the Masons, basically any counterfeit religion which makes pretensions to being very intellectual and rarefied that way are going to be tapping into some of these Platonic themes in one way or another. And these people are all around us. Some people would even say they're the ones that rule over us. And therefore, it is important for us to have an answer for people that take this approach. Maybe we're even tempted ourselves as Christians. Many Christians throughout history have been attracted to Platonism because it seems to emphasize universality and objectivity in a way that most non-Christian philosophy did not, most paganism did not do. It seemed to establish that truth was international. It wasn't just our religion, but it was a view of reality that covered the full scope. And so it's very, very important in that respect. Now, the two themes that Van Til is going to address can be divided into metaphysics and epistemology. So, in other words, a critique of Plato's theory of being and a critique of his theory of how we know. How do you know anything, let alone Plato's world of ideas? And as usual, the paradigm is the creator creature distinction. And of course, just to summarize in a thumbnail, Plato's ideas are an attempt by the creature to jump into the realm of the creator without having the actual creator. And then, as far as his knowledge program goes, we're again making the creature the rule for everything. And so, in a sense, the creature is the definition of reality. And so he mingles the creator and the creature. The creature is the creator in the sense that his mind is the standard. So that theory which satisfies man's mind, man's logic, man's objections, that's the true reality that goes beyond the creature. So the creature is the full source then. And of course, by denying this Christian dualism of creator creature, he ends up with a different dualism, namely the forms and the flux of matter. And so, once again, Van Til is going to be trying to show from a variety of angles, you could say the impossibility of the contrary, that here this great effort by the great philosopher Plato is still attempting to kind of deal with this fundamental duality of reality, creator creature duality. But he can't because he has only his own mind. Okay, well, with that, let's dive in. I'm starting the Greg Bahnsen book, Van Til's Apologetic, at page 318. Van Til. In his doctrine of reminiscence, as well as in his doctrine of ideal identification of man with God through intuition, Plato laid great emphasis upon the principle of changeless unity. Man had himself to be participant in this principle in order to have unity in his experience. Accordingly, he tended to deny either the existence or at least the real significance of change. The world of becoming had only a quasi-existence, and knowledge of it was only a quasi-knowledge. In man, however, there was a rational soul which was not part of this quasi-existent world of chance, but was participant in the divine. Plato spoke much of the reality of that which is above man in the way of eternal truth. In order for man to exist and to know it all, he had to be essentially divine. That is, in his intellectual soul, man had to be participant in the very being of the ideal world. The world of temporal reality was not, for Plato, the revelation of the self-contained God. If, therefore, he could prove that his worldview could make intelligible the nature of reality, thereby making the world understandable without reference to the Creator-Redeemer, he would have justified to himself and to his followers his covenant-breaking attitude. A quick comment on this phrase that tags Plato as having a covenant-breaking attitude. Someone might object that this is unfair because Plato was not knowledgeable about the covenant and therefore couldn't break the covenant. Now, there actually have been Christians from time to time that were so impressed with Plato's thought that they supposed or hypothesized that Plato actually was familiar with the Israelite prophets, that he must have had access, let's say, to Isaiah at least, in order to come up with such sublime ideas. I think we can remain skeptical of that hypothesis and ask ourselves if he was ignorant, which seems to be the case, is it fair to call him covenant breaking? And I think the point for us reading Van Til is to say that objectively, his scheme of thought is covenant breaking, for us at least. And I think that we can say that he, as a member of the human race to whom special revelation was given, the knowledge of God was given to humanity, both at the first head of Adam and the quasi first head of Noah, that humanity, if you think of humanity as a whole, as a Platonic whole, if you will, is largely involved in covenant breaking, of which they know better. But I think we can remain neutral on the question of Plato personally in order to grab Van Til's point here. Objectively, it's a position which is covenant breaking. Continuing. As for Plato, this monistic assumption may be observed first from the hard and fast distinction that he makes between the world of being that is wholly known and the world of non-being that is wholly unknown. For Plato, any being that is really to exist must be eternal and changeless. Similarly, any knowledge that really can be called knowledge must be changeless, comprehensive knowledge. It is in terms of these principles that Plato would explain the world of phenomena. This world is intermediate between the world of pure being that is wholly known and the world of pure non-being that is wholly unknown. The being that we see constitutes a sort of tension between pure being and pure non-being. So also the learning process constitutes a sort of tension between pure omniscience and pure ignorance. So in one sentence, he's capturing the twofold, the two-prong model of how to reflect on Plato's thought, being and knowledge, metaphysics and epistemology. Now, Van Til is modeling the metaphysics as saying that this world of changing flux that we call our world is intermediate between pure being and pure non-being. I think you could also model this as the world of the changing flux is in fact non-being because of the paradoxes that Parmenides put forth, showing that the propositions are contradictory because of the flux, and therefore it doesn't have being. Its being is contradicted by non-being. So they played games that, I shouldn't say they played games. They made arguments that to some of us moderns seem like playing word games. But whether Plato pushed the non-being to a substrate that's totally unknowable, and the world of ideas that's pure being and knowable, and that the world of flux is in between, or whether the world of flux should itself be regarded as that subterranean world of non-being. I think you could go either way and still follow Van Til's argument here. Plato's view of the relation of sensation and conceptual thought corresponds to this basic division between the worlds of pure being and pure non-being. The senses are said to deceive us. It is only by means of the intellect as inherently divine that man can know true being. The real philosopher bewails his contact with the world of non-being. He knows he has fallen from his heavenly home. He knows that he is real only to the extent that he is divine. He seeks to draw away from all contact with non-being. He seeks for identification with the wholly other, which for the moment he can speak of only in negative terms. When Socrates speaks of the good, he can only say what it is not. The ideal table is never seen on land or sea. Piety must be defined as beyond anything that gods or men may say about it. True definition needs for its criterion an all-inclusive, super-divine, as well as superhuman principle of continuity. Ultimate rationality is as much above God as above man. The result is that for Plato, too, nature is revelational, but it is revelational as much of man as of God. To the extent that either of them is real and known as real, he is wholly identical with the rational principle that is above both. On the other hand, as real and known in the rational principle, both are face to face with the world of non-being. And this world of non-being is as ultimate as the world of pure being. And here again, if you think of my introductory remarks, I think that seems paradoxical to say that the world of non-being is as ultimate as the world of being for Plato. But I think, again, it's the reason for suggesting this is because the ideas don't make sense until they're instantiated in their own shadows. So the pure, abstract, and eternal essences, pure distilled beings, they actually need their own shadow to justify their own meaning. So therefore, the underworld is just as necessary as the upper world is. They're both equally ultimate. Thus, both God and man are both wholly known and wholly unknown to themselves. Reality as known to man is a cross between abstract, timeless, formal logic and equally abstract chance. Yet in it, all the ideal pure rationality as pure being dominates the scene. So you can see here what Van Til has done. He's reframing the Platonic project in terms of these Van Tilian categories of wholly known and wholly unknown, purely rational and purely chance, and showing that Plato exemplifies these dualities par excellence. You have the pure being, and then you have this flux under here. The flux is unknown, and being unknown, it's essentially chance. In other words, there's no necessity to it. There's no way to deduce which shadow is going to appear where. It's just, as far as your mind is concerned, it's pure chance. But your mind is the only thing that knows because it's the thing connected with the ideas. So you have this tension between the pure knowledge and the pure lack of knowledge. That's why he says that both man and God are both wholly known and wholly unknown to themselves. Skipping down to the last paragraph on page 321. The form of the presentation in the symposium is metaphorical, but we can already see the direction in which Plato's thought is moving. The true nature of man is his soul and not his body. A dualism is developing. So let me break off here just to remind us that the Van Tillian project is to show that this is the true dualism, the creator-creature distinction. Man's efforts at knowledge and philosophy invariably replace the creature as the monistic Archimedean point, source, basis for what's valid, what's invalid. But in doing so, and thereby denying the creator-creature distinction, it's almost like a nuclear fission with cascading dualisms that arise in its place. He has to keep holding down these opposites that keep popping up because of that fundamental false starting point. Van Til. Moreover, the true nature of man is the intellect and not the senses. Only through the intellect can man come into contact with the universals, and these universal ideas have more reality than the particulars of sense experience. Another dualism is developing. The true function of man's soul is contemplation of the ideas, and its highest destiny is separation from the world of sense in order to be wholly absorbed in the contemplation of ideas. In the Phaedo, this line of argument is pursued in still more detail. True knowledge is of universals only, and it is the soul in its intellectual capacity that is fitted to come into contact with this world. Still, we must not draw this argument too sharply. Even in the Protagoras, an early dialogue, Plato has made Socrates admit that if virtue is teachable, there must be a stage of learning. And this could not be the case if there is too sharp a separation between the world of sense and the world of ideas. In that case, one either knows or does not know. One is either in contact with the ideal world and therefore in possession of it as knowledge, or one is a poor earthworm and knows nothing at all. Some reality must be given to the world of sense, inasmuch as learning seems to be possible. Perhaps the indwelling of the soul in the body is not altogether in vain. The nasty problem why there should be an incarnation of the ideas at all is not here discussed. Even in Plato's maturest thought, as expressed in the Timaeus, there is only a faintest suggestion of the idea that it is perhaps the soul's function to bring together two opposing forces in the universe, namely spirit and matter. And here he's going to launch off on that idea to make the connection with the Christian notion of atonement or reconciliation, which is a bit odd because elsewhere, Van Til, no less than Reformed theology in general, is going to emphasize the notion of atonement as an ethical matter, of healing the breach due to man's sin and rebellion. But here he almost seems to give a nod to what you might call more the Eastern Orthodox notion of a reconciliation of being, that man's problem is he needs to be divinized and lifted up to a different type of being. So he says here, This lack of any notion of reconciliation that at all approaches the Christian idea of the subject corroborates what was said above about the assumption on the part of the Greeks that the mind of man is naturally sound. It is assumed that there is no reconciliation to be made between God and man. If there is any reconciliation to be made at all, it is the mind of man that is to do the reconciling. Instead of needing a mediator, the mind of man sets itself up as mediator if there is to be any mediator at all. So that paragraph is a bit surprising to me. I would hope that perhaps young Vantillians might dig in on this small theme broached by Van Til and perhaps explore whether he has a second theory of reconciliation having to do with the world of these two worlds of Platonic being and the flux of our world, as opposed to this ethical breach that he normally is emphatic about. So here I'll just leave it at that, that it's interesting that he sees mediatorship of Christ as broader than merely the ethical reconciliation. Perhaps he is hinting at a notion that Christ's incarnation, and hence being both God and man, the God man, was a necessary fact of redemptive history, even apart from redemption. So, hence, not redemptive history, but history. That the Christ theme is necessary for our knowledge. I've never heard that described by Vantillians before. So, that would be an interesting topic to try to unpack a bit more. Anyway, continuing. Bottom of page 322. For all practical purposes, Plato's conception of time as the moving image of eternity amounts to saying that the eternal and the temporal are equally ultimate aspects of one general reality. According to Plato, time and eternity are equally underived. And this reminds me, this whole subject of time is a very active one in modern philosophy. There's many books being written or have been written in the last 20 years on the subject of time. And this description of the Platonic view almost sounds like what's called the moving spotlight view of time, whereby such philosophers suggest that the entire temporal expanse history of the universe at a higher dimension is frozen. All is simultaneously existent. And then what we call the now, or our temporal sense of transition, is a spotlight moving along this four-dimensional manifold. Whatever the spotlight is illuminating is the now. I myself find this an incoherent view because now you need a third thing, the spotlight, and you have to give an account for that, which I don't see them doing successfully. But I'm just giving you something to tap into in modern philosophy, to this view that Plato apparently held according to Van Til's exposition. Plato was still willing to attribute some possible meaning to the myths of which the forefathers spoke. Plato, of course, as a philosopher, begins by assuming that the human mind is capable of meeting the riddles of the universe, but that when man sees more deeply into the limitations of human thought, he is willing to listen with some respect to those who claim to have had revelation from the gods. There might possibly be something to these myths after all. So Plato's chief argument is here that the soul partakes of the idea of life and therefore is immortal. Soul is in intimate relation with ideas, but is not itself an idea. Here we strike at the heart of the matter. The idea of life partakes of the general characteristics of all ideas, namely that it is eternal and self-existent. Now, of this idea of life, the soul is a concrete manifestation or particularization. The soul participates in the idea of life and is therefore underived, in which case the notion of change is taken right into the realm of ideas. Okay, well, as usual, there's been more richness to delve into than I had anticipated, meaning it took longer than I thought it would. So I'm going to stop here and finish the Plato reading in a second video. We'll tie up some of the loose ends at that time. See you then. Bye bye.